Number 10. The pillory. You're standing in a market square, neck locked in wood, hands pinned. You cannot move your face away from whatever is coming, and something is always coming. The pillory was not designed to cause pain. That's the part people miss. Medieval courts were not interested in hurting your body. They were interested in something that lasts much longer than pain. Your body heals. A broken arm, a deep cut, the body sorts it out. But standing in a public square while an entire town watches you get pelted with garbage and filth and broken glass, that does not heal. That follows you for the rest of your life. Every face you see on the street after that day saw it happen. Court records from 13th and 14th century England show people dying in the pillory, not from the device, from what the crowd threw. The sentence was humiliation. The crowd sometimes made it execution. And here is the thing that matters most about this. The crowd was not out of control. The crowd was supposed to be there. Every rock thrown was legally part of the punishment. Every insult was sanctioned. The church approved it. The court ordered it. The townspeople carried it out. The state did not need to lay a hand on you. It just needed to put you in front of your own community and step back. Physical pain heals. But the face that an entire town watched get broken in public, that does not come. Number 9. Pain forte che due. Ask yourself something before we get into this. Stones are being stacked on your chest one at a time. You are lying on cold stone in a dark cell. The weight is building slowly. You can still stop it. All you have to do is say 2 words and enter a plea. Would you speak? Some people chose not to. That tells you a great deal about what medieval justice actually was. Peine forte et dure, law French for hard and forceful punishment, was used on defendants who refused to enter a plea. Under English common law, a trial could not begin without one, and if you stayed silent, the court could not convict you, could not touch your land, could not take your family's inheritance. Silence was a legal move, so the court invented a counter-move dark cell, stone floor, wooden board across the chest. Then weights, stones and iron, added slowly, hour after hour. Not enough to kill fast, just enough to press down. You got 3 pieces of the worst bread on the first day, 3 sips of dirty water on the second. Nothing else in 1692, not medieval England but colonial America, where this exact same law had crossed an ocean and was still being used. A man named Giles Corey was accused during the Salem witch trials. He refused to speak. The weights were brought. 2 days passed under them. The sheriff came back and asked one more time. Giles Corey said 2 words. More weight. He died without entering a plea. His land went to his sons, exactly as he planned. Now think about what the law was actually saying about all of this. The state was not just hurting you, it was giving you a choice. Speak and face trial. Stay silent and be crushed. Your call, your decision, legally yours, which means every person who died under those stones, in the eyes of the court, had chosen it freely. The ribs go before the lungs do. Death comes slowly as the chest can no longer rise. Number 8. The Judas cradle. The Spanish Inquisition had a written rule, formal, theological, absolute, ne effusio sanguinis, no shedding of blood. Courts operating under the church were forbidden from drawing blood when getting a confession. So the men who built the torture devices had a very specific problem to solve. Cause enough suffering to break a person. Get a confession. Leave nothing visible that a court could later call excessive. The Judas cradle was what they came up with, a wooden frame. At the top, a pyramid-shaped seat with a sharpened point. The person was lifted by ropes and held above it, then lowered, slowly, completely under the operator's control. The body's own weight did the work. The operator just managed the rope. Down, stop, up slightly, down again. The historian Melise Ruthven studied the surviving records of inquisitorial courts and found that devices like this were built with one very deliberate purpose: produce suffering without producing wounds that could be used as evidence. No blood, nothing visible, technically within the rules. What followed extended sessions, internal damage, tissue injury, infection, days without sleep used alongside it. None of that left the kind of marks the prohibition was meant to prevent. This is the point where the history stops being about cruelty and becomes about something colder. This device was not the work of a violent man acting alone. It was engineered carefully, over years, by people working inside an institution that had rules, and they built something that followed every rule while destroying everything those rules were meant to protect. The church said, "Do not spill blood." The builders said, "Understood." Number 7. Rat torture. The rats were often never released. Let that land for a moment. There is a kind of fear that sits underneath thought, underneath reason, underneath every calm and rational thing your mind knows how to do. You cannot argue your way out of it. You cannot talk yourself down from it. It just hits, and everything else falls away. The people running medieval interrogations knew this. At some point, someone stopped looking for a new instrument and looked at what the natural world had already built, and understood that the tool was less important than the placement. The method shows up in records across continental Europe under different names: a sealed metal container, a cage, a bucket, a fitted box, placed against the stomach or chest, rats inside, heat applied from the outside. With nowhere to go, the animals turned toward the only way out. Dutch records from the 17th century place this in formal interrogation rooms. Not dark dungeons, rooms with procedure, rooms with documentation. George Orwell wrote about this specific terror in 1984 with such accuracy that historians of torture have pointed to it as one of the most truthful literary descriptions of this method ever written. Not because he invented it, because he had read what actually happened. Here is what makes this entry different from the rest. Confessions came before anything was done, before the container opened, before the rats moved. The knowledge of what was inside, the sound, the heat starting to build, that alone was enough. The mind broke before the body was touched. That was always the point. The rats were almost secondary. The real instrument was the 30 seconds of knowing what was about to happen. Number 6 took a different approach entirely. It did not use fear of what might come. It used the body itself, after death, as the message. And what turned up in church doorways across Northern Europe will show you exactly what that. Number 6. Flaying removing a person's skin is not an act of rage. It is an act of communication. That was the point. That was always the point. And the fact that this logic appeared independently across completely separate civilizations, thousands of years and thousands of miles apart, is itself the most unsettling part of this entry. The Assyrian stone carvings at Nineveh and Nimrud, sitting right now in the British Museum and the Louvre, show flaying in careful detail. They date to the reign of Ashurnasirpal the Tombed in the 9th century BCE. The cuneiform text next to those images does not hide the purpose. It states it. The goal was to produce a surface, human skin stretched and displayed on city walls, draped over gates, visible to every person who passed through. The execution created a permanent warning. The body was the message board. In medieval Europe, the practice appears in chronicles of the period. The skin of William de Morisco, executed in England in 1242, was reportedly preserved after his death. In Scandinavian and Irish records, flaying is documented for specific crimes, especially violations of sanctuary. Archaeological work at Danish church sites has turned up what researchers believe may be door coverings of human origin, though that evidence is still being debated. What makes flaying different from everything else on this list is not the killing. The killing was almost beside the point. Every other punishment here ends when the person does. This one was designed specifically so the person's body would keep working, as a tool, as a statement from the state. Long after they were gone, the execution was the opening act, not the ending. The message was the point. The person was the material. Number 5. Hanged, drawn and quartered. This was not a punishment. Call it what it actually was. A ceremony. 4 acts, each one meant to be watched, talked about, carried home in the memory of everyone who witnessed it, and feared by everyone who only heard the description later. Hanged, drawn, and quartered was the legal sentence for high treason in medieval and early modern England. The court records are specific about how it was staged. The condemned was dragged through the streets on a hurdle first, that dragging written into the sentence as deliberate humiliation before anything else began. Then hanged, but not to death, cut down while still conscious. Then drawn, entrails removed and burned in front of them while they could still see. Then beheaded, then the body cut into 4 parts and physically sent across the kingdom, hung at city gates, placed above castle walls, put on display at bridges. The sentence was written so that it was impossible to bury the person whole. The legal historian J.G. Bellamy traced this back to Edward I in the late 13th century and found the state's reasoning written plainly in the records. Treason was not just a crime, it was a break in the natural order. Simply killing the person was not enough. The body had to be destroyed visibly, publicly, in a way that reflected what the traitor had tried to do to the kingdom itself. Thousands watched these events. They were not riots, they were announced in advance. Food was sold, families came. What this shows about how the medieval state thought about the body is something modern justice has moved completely away from. Today, a person is imprisoned. Their body stays theirs. In medieval English law, for the highest crime, the body was taken. It became the property of the crown, and the crown decided, in writing, beforehand, where every piece of it would go. William Wallace, Hugh Despenser, Thomas More's head on London Bridge. The state was sending a message. Every person in the kingdom was meant. Number 4. Scarfism. Nearly every other method on this list needs someone in the room. A tool, a hand, a person doing something actively. This one needs none of that. Scaphism comes from the Greek historian Plutarch, drawing on Persian sources. It appears in at least one documented account involving a military figure named Clearchus of Rhegium. Some historians have questioned how widely it was used, but the mechanics are specific enough and consistent enough with what modern biology tells us that researchers treat it as historical fact rather than story. The condemned was placed between 2 hollowed-out wooden vessels fitted together with the head, hands and feet sticking out. They were force-fed milk and honey until severe diarrhea set in. The same mixture was applied to every exposed part of the body. The face, ears, eyes, mouth. The vessel was floated onto a still, stagnant body of water. Then everyone left. Flies came first. Then every other kind of insect, drawn by the sugar and what the body was producing. They got inside through the gaps, laid eggs. Gangrene developed slowly in the flesh. The person was returned to daily, fed again. Kept alive long enough for the process to keep going. Ancient accounts claim some victims lasted more than 2 weeks. Researchers are careful with those exact numbers, but the biological process itself, every part of it works exactly the way it is described. Modern forensic science confirms it. Here is the detail that changes this entire entry Once the preparation was done, the person doing it could go home, come back tomorrow, check, leave the feeding mixture, leave again. No skill needed after that point, no tool, no presence. The natural world, set up correctly, handled everything else completely on its own. Number 3. Breaking on the wheel. In 15th and 16th century France and Germany, this was a profession. Men trained for it, spent years learning to do it properly, and everywhere it was practiced, it was a legal proceeding, with documents, with official witnesses, with records kept. The Catherine wheel, named, with dark irony, after a saint said to have been killed on one, was used across continental Europe from the medieval period through the 18th century. The condemned was bound to the ground or a large wooden frame. The executioner used a heavy iron-rimmed wagon wheel to break the bones of the limbs in a set order, arms first, then legs, working from the outside in toward the body. That order was not left to the executioner. It was written in the sentence. The historian Richard Evans studied executioners' manuals and criminal records from German territories and found how legally detailed this all was. The number of blows, where they landed, the sequence. The worse the crime, the more blows, the longer the dying lasted. The living body was then woven through the spokes of the wheel and raised on a pole in public view. Now stop on this next part. Courts could write mercy into the sentence. A sentence might say the condemned gets a final killing blow to the chest, or head after a set number of breaks, or it might say no such blow is permitted. The difference between dying in 3 hours and dying over 3 days was a single line of text in a document signed before the execution started. Families asked for the mercy clause. Courts argued over it. All of it went into the records. These were not things done in dark rooms away from public knowledge. They were run the same way any formal legal proceeding was run, with forms, witnesses, process, appeals, and a final authorized signature at the bottom. The system had paperwork. The paperwork was filed. That is not a comparison. Number 2. Being buried alive as legal sentence. There is a silence that belongs only to a sealed room underground. The Romans had a legal category for what they put inside one. Vestal virgins found guilty of breaking their vows of chastity could not be executed in the normal way. Roman religious law was clear on this. A vestal's blood was sacred. The state could not spill it, could not act against her body directly. So the state found a way around that problem. The woman was carried through the city in a sealed box, closed, so that no one present would have to be a witness to what was actually happening. At the end of that journey, a small underground room was waiting. Inside it, a lamp, a small amount of food and water, just enough to allow the state to argue, legally, that this was not an execution. The entrance was sealed. The officials walked away. The law then maintained, in writing, that whatever happened next was not the state's doing. The state had only sealed a room. The room was responsible for what followed. Plutarch records multiple cases. Livy records them. The ritual details are confirmed across different ancient sources. This was not cynicism. This was religious law operating at its most technically precise. The body was sacred and could not be harmed directly. So the law built conditions where harm became certain, and then carefully removed itself from the chain of events. Medieval Europe carried versions of this logic forward. The practice of immurement, sealing a living person within a wall or enclosed space, shows up in church records, though many of the specific accounts historians have found are still contested. What is confirmed is that this legal structure, create the conditions, step back, maintain that no direct act occurred, existed in Roman law, survived into the medieval period, and shaped how later institutions thought about causing death without technically causing it. And here is what this entry is really about. Every institution in history that caused someone's death through neglect, through policy, through cutting off what a person needed to survive, and then produced reports explaining that no individual was responsible, that what happened was natural, that the institution itself took no direct action. Every one of those institutions learned from the same playbook. The Romans did not write the first chapter, but they filed the paperwork. Number 1. Linkle, it did not end in the Middle Ages. That is not a dramatic opener. That is a documented fact, and it is the only reason this belongs at number 1. Lynchi, slow slicing, the lingering death, death by 1,000 cuts, was a formal legal method of execution in imperial China. It appears in Chinese law as early as the 10th century. It was written into the statutes of the Ming dynasty, written again into the statutes of the Qing dynasty, and it was carried out with officials present, with court documents signed, with photographers recording it, until 1905, 1905. Stay with that year for a moment. In 1905, Einstein published the special theory of relativity. Norway became an independent country. The first permanent cinemas were opening across Europe and America. The modern world was not on its way. It was already here, and in a government building in China, a man whose job this was, trained for this specific role, was carrying out a sentence that had been in the written law for 900 years. The method was reserved for the worst categories of crime under imperial law: high treason, killing one's own father, a servant murdering a master. These were not just legal violations. Under Confucian thinking, they were breaks in the order that held heaven, family, and state together. The body was not yours alone. It came from your ancestors. To violate the structure at this level was to violate something far beyond yourself. Simply killing the person was not enough. The body had to be taken apart, carefully, deliberately, over time. There were men who trained specifically for this. Their skill was in keeping the process going as long as possible. Court documents from the Qing dynasty describe sentences with specified numbers of cuts. The length of the death was determined legally before it began. Officials attended. Everything was recorded. In 1905, French colonial photographers in China documented one such execution. Those photographs were later studied by the philosopher Georges Bataille. They exist. They are in archives. No one disputes what they show. Now here is what I want you to sit with as this ends. Every other thing on this list belongs, in our heads, to a world we have left behind. The pillory came down. The Inquisition courts closed. The wheels stopped being used. Hanged, drawn, and quartered ended. We put all of it in the past where it feels safely distant. Lynchi does not let you do that. It was not a dying practice hanging on at the edges. It was legally supported, institutionally maintained, and formally carried out in a country of hundreds of millions of people. In the exact same year, the modern world was making the science and the politics and the culture we still live inside today. The distance between medieval and modern is a story we tell ourselves because it makes us feel better, because it puts all of this safely over there, behind glass, with a label on it. The dates do not always agree with that story. The law called it justice. The officials signed the papers. The photographers developed the film. And the 20th century kept moving around it on every side, as if nothing out of the ordinary was